Hello, good morning, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Today, we're going to be chatting with Cameron over at Pill Club. We're going to be focusing on two different elements. For the start of this presentation, we're going to be looking at a couple of use cases that Cameron is putting into play over at Pill Club on how he and his team is securing their dev environment. And then we're going to shift over to a fireside chat, which will be co-hosted by our CPO and co-founder, Alex. Before we get started, let's introduce our guest speaker today, Cameron Seeback. He is the Senior DevOps Engineer and Team Lead over at Pill Club. As the DevOps engineer, Cameron was the first to identify opportunities for expanded use of cloud computing services across the Pill Club. He has led the implementation of systems that handle millions of SMS messages monthly and leverage Elasticsearch to optimize operation workflows. Passionate about all things AWS, Cameron builds solutions that meet the scaling challenges, strict security needs, and compliance goals of a hyper-growth healthcare business. He composes electronic music under the name of Ham Sandwich Quantum Party and holds a BA in computer science from Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa.
If you're just joining us right now, so I'm talking to Cameron Seebach, who's a senior DevOps engineer and tech lead at Pill Club. So yeah, really appreciate you guys over the presentation. I've learned some things, but I definitely have some more questions. So I'd love to sort of go into that. But just as a quick introduction of myself, I'm one of the co-founders of TwinGate. I'm currently the chief product officer, and we've sort of seen this through from the very beginning. And one of the things I think we've been very, very passionate about is that, if you look at the sort of the zero trust space, it just sort of makes sense as this direction that things have been going in, and sort of makes sense as like a model that's a lot easier for companies to use and sort of and adopt. And so we've been really, really passionate about like making things easy to adopt. So we'll have some questions about that for you in a second. But just to kind of like jump into a little bit more about a little more background and depth on some of your experience at the Pill Club. Could you give us a little bit more background on like I think there's some sequencing things here. There's sort of the background of like what you were doing previously to gain secure access into some of your more privileged environments. And then I think that's sort of like a parallel effort to some of the changes you were just describing in terms of like making the dev environment sort of more stable and easier to get up and running. So you like maybe talk a little bit more like what that decision making was like. Did those two things come together? Was one independent of the other? I'd love to hear a bit more about that, and then we can dig in.
Sure. So, specifically, this kind of access into a dev environment wasn't really possible before we adopted TwinGate. So there's that piece right there that we should definitely dig into. But to go back a couple of steps, we were using across the company a traditional VPN. That was, we tried working with a split tunnel setup that many of you are familiar with, and that has its own headaches and challenges. The VPN went down all the time because it was trying to serve too much traffic. Whenever we had a user come in that needed to be added to the VPN, it was always a hassle that involved sometimes restarting the whole service and taking down access for more folks than we would like. So we made the switch to TwinGate. I think maybe it's been a year and a half or something like that ago. And the experience is way different. We were using a really hefty machine to power our VPN solution before because it was serving everybody's traffic. Now we spend maybe $40 on our machines to serve over 400 users. So that kind of came parallel to the stuff that we were doing with these dev environments, where we started solving the access challenges for folks across the company with TwinGate. And then we took a look at this engineering environment that we had built and said, well, this is okay, but how do we enable really good collaboration without having to install a heavyweight VPN solution on every developer's machine? And because TwinGate works essentially on top of existing DNS standards, we can just drop the TwinGate connectors inside these machines. They're lightweight. They only take up resources really when they're being used. And it's been such a huge difference in what we can do.
And so would you say, I mean, what's sort of an interesting comment, I think you made a little bit earlier, that, you know, a lot of this wouldn't necessarily be possible. So maybe not necessarily like Twingate specifically, but when you think about what this sort of like zero trust approach sort of lets you achieve, like, do you think, like, how do you think you would have actually deployed these dev environments without something like this? Like, what would the approach have been?
Gosh, it would have been something probably like we would have had a secure shell forwarding system that was inside every developer environment, that would have talked to some kind of a central service that we would have to spin up ourselves. And there would have been that kind of central point of failure for this, that I would have been really worried about. And there would have been a lot of kind of access and administration hurdles that we don't have today. There would have been things like making sure that developer machines had proper SSH keys. There would have been things like making sure that we had scoped the security and firewall groups on that central resource properly. And these are challenges that I don't think I would have been willing to take on. It would have been a lot of additional work on the DevOps plate.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of what we hear, sort of like existing environments and sort of what you're describing is like similar to what we've heard before. Is it often like so it's very brittle, right? So they can be very sensitive to either, as you mentioned, like single point of failure, but actually having like lots of individual configuration settings or files that need to be in place for everything to work correctly together. What do you think? Actually, before I go to the next question, on that point, you mentioned earlier that one of the sort of advantages is that you can have things administered sort of centrally. So how do you think that sort of like shifted the responsibilities between configuring the environments, make sure they're up and running versus maintaining access? And maybe there's some things that actually don't work as you'd like right now, but sort of curious how you'd look at that split right now.
So one of the great things that Twingate enables us to do is to link in our existing single sign-on provider for managing access. So when people enter or exit the company, those settings are applied immediately on the day of. Whereas if it were up to the DevOps team to administer that access, we have seen, unfortunately, that sometimes we miss a departure or an entrance of employees. So that's one part that is made really easy via the deployment of Twingate. And then to answer the other part of your question, you're asking specifically about the ways in which the DevOps team has shifted its responsibility, sort of.
Yeah, because I guess sort of like answer a little bit. So it sounds like before you might have been responsible for defining, building, defining process around the environment, and then also managing access. So it sounds like where you've sort of ended up is this place where you can sort of be more focused on the environment itself, and then access becomes a responsibility that you can either share or move on to another team, like you're saying with the IDP integration.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I don't spend any time managing, or I don't spend any time pushing people in and out of groups anymore. I spend my time when I'm working on developer productivity concerns like this, I spend my time just on making that experience of installing the software and configuring it easier, which is a huge reduction in the amount of effort required.
Great. No, that's I think it's maybe for anyone listening, I think that's listening or watching, I think that's a really important point, actually, that you can split these responsibilities. Or I think previously you had, I think with sort of with past or existing methods, you're sort of linking your network, infrastructure, or the way you're configuring your environment to access. Like now you can actually split those things out. So we've talked about some of the good things. So tell us a little bit about what the process was like in terms of how difficult it was. Like, did you run into limitations or challenges along the way? Like, what was it all like?
So there were a few challenges. The one that is most prominent in my mind is that we had to come up with a way of basically an environment that a user in the engineering side could check in and out as needed. And that basically means that over the course of a day, an engineering user might check out, like, let's say, environment dev 1 or something like that. And we had to find a way to say, okay, a user could check out one of these environments, but we don't necessarily know when they've stopped using it. And we ended up solving that basically with a API integration with TwinGate, where we check to see if the resource that is attached to that particular developer environment is up and running or not. And if that developer environment is not running, we give it like 30 minutes and we check a couple of times. And if it's still not running at the end of that time, we check that developer out of that environment and leave it for use by other developers. So that was one of the challenges that we had. Another challenge was making sure that while we were developing these developer environments, that we were keeping in mind our audience, right? Because there are many different kinds of developers. Even in our team of 40 or 50 engineers, there are some developers who want things to be up and running and don't really care how it's done. And then there are developers who want to really get into the details of how that MySQL password is configured, or which database tables are loaded at app startup, stuff like that. So we've done our best to strike a balance between, hey, these are reasonable defaults that we think work for this environment. We run our end-to-end tests on that environment to make sure that it's running and building okay. But we also offer a lot of knobs and buttons for engineers who want to tweak things to their satisfaction. And striking that balance was challenging at first. And it was challenging also for engineers to adopt the idea that they were not necessarily in control over every detail of their environment. I think as we've gone on through this implementation, they're starting to discover that it is actually better to have a set of defaults than to configure everything from scratch, and just in terms of the time savings. But that has been a shift in the way that our engineers think about their development environments.
Yeah, as you bring up, I think a really closely related area in all this, which is that you can make the sort of the technical or the configuration or the engineering changes, but there's actually a lot of internal change management and communication that has to happen. How did you guys approach that, and did you run into any resistance, and how did you overcome some of those things? Yeah.
So we did our rollout in a couple of different ways. We started first with the front end focused engineers, who typically are a lot more interested in just getting something up and running. And once we were able to make some of those engineers into champions for this approach, the rollout across the rest of the team was a lot easier. And on top of that, we started saying things like, you don't have to use this environment. It's totally optional. I can tell you it will save you a couple of days every time you need to rebuild something, but you don't need to use it. And that kind of a non-aggressive approach towards rolling this out really helped us, because when people feel that they have a choice about whether or not to do something like this, and they can evaluate the benefits and risks a lot more easily than if it's a forced thing.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Okay, I got one more question here, actually, from one of the attendees, and then want to move on to a little more about your background and how what your journey through DevOps has been. So the question here from Aran is really around whether you had any sort of security compliance or risk hurdles that you had to overcome now that your remote access solution is tied to a third party or TwinGate versus self-managed VPN infrastructure. So that's the question.
That's a great question. So there are a number of ways to think about these kinds of trade-offs. And the way that we think about them at the Pill Club is most of the traffic that's flowing through TwinGate is encrypted already, because a large portion of it is HTTPS traffic. So that is one thing that we really like. And the other thing is there are always going to be security and compliance trade-offs to make when you are considering any kind of a VPN solution. And the way we think about them is that I'd much rather have a team like TwinGate that is dedicated to making sure that the environment is secure and compliant than trusting my team of 3 people to do their best to keep up with security patches, ongoing cyber attacks and risks like that. And we feel that that's a great trade-off to make to, as we were talking earlier, have a separation of those concerns. Have my team be focused on providing a lot of value to the business and also to auditing how we're doing with the twin gate configuration. But then have the twin gate team be primarily focused on their side of the equation. Yeah.
Great. All right. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit, just for anyone else listening, sort of in the DevOps arena, or people that are maybe interested in getting into DevOps. Could you talk a little bit more about like how you got into the role? I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but if you talk a little about your journey and maybe along the way, explain like what advice you'd have for somebody that's looking to do the same.
Sure. So, gosh, where should I start? There's a lot there. So when I was 20, I started out as an IT administrator at a law firm. And I was the most junior of the most junior folks there. So I remember doing things like foam cleaning keyboards, and like if a printer went offline, I'd go over to that person's computer and reinstall the drivers. And although it looked like magic to the folks that I was helping and it put a smile on their face, it always felt a little bit to me like I could do more. So I worked there for a couple of years, and then decided to go back into school and actually learn some programming. So I got a computer science degree, and I loved it. It was amazing. Just the idea that you can type these magic incantations into the computer and something pops up on the screen or sends a request somewhere. That was really cool. So I started, I moved to the Bay Area. I started work at a fintech company as an application developer. It was a Ruby on Rails stack. Ruby is a fantastic language, but it is very slow, for those of you who know. And I worked there for a couple of years, and I realized that I was always interested in the infrastructure pieces of something. How the database connections worked, what kind of proxy was in place to send requests from the front end server to the back end server, things like that. And when I got the opportunity to switch jobs, I started thinking more seriously about this, and I raised it with my VP of engineering one day, and I said, "Hey, I have had a lot of experience working with the infrastructure at our company. I'd like to eventually become a DevOps engineer." And I remember that conversation. And he basically looked at me for a second. And he said, "Okay, let's start training you on CI processes and get you into our AWS environment so you can start building some features there that we really need." So I made the switch from being a pure Ruby on Rails Java application developer to building things that were kind of in the middle there. Like I worked on a lot of continuous integration environments. I worked on a lot of spinning up Docker files for new applications and containers. And that was all really fruitful for me. So, what I'd recommend to folks who are interested in becoming DevOps engineers, I'd recommend that you get a wide swath of experience. You don't necessarily need to be an expert at everything you do, but you need to have some familiarity with the whole stack. And the easiest way to get that, in my opinion, is just to ask if you can help out on a project like that. You probably are in an environment where there are existing DevOps engineers that you can work with closely on a project. You may be lucky enough, like me, to have a VP of Eng who can see that you want to do this stuff and is willing to take a risk. And there are so many good ways to get into the field now.
Yeah, No, absolutely. So yeah, I think there's like some really great advice sort of embedded in all that, which is that I think a lot of times, especially when you're talking to people sort of like earlier in their career, trying to figure out like what they should do. And I think that the consequences of early career decisions seem much greater than they really are. And so I think like sounds like I think I'm sort of paraphrasing a little bit. So the advice would be sort of just start somewhere where you're interested. So maybe in your case, it's on the application side, but then just like continue to explore what else might be interesting until you find something that you're really passionate about. And then I think the big one as well is just another piece of advice would be just ask. A lot of times it's just a question of just asking for something, and you'll often get it. So I think that's really great advice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, especially in the DevOps space, where it is so hard to hire DevOps engineers. If I were a VP and I saw that somebody had some infrastructure talent, and they asked me if I could have them do an infrastructure project, I would be all over that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think it's also, it's. I mean, how do you? I mean, I guess from what you're saying, your stories are sort of you found out about the role because you sort of saw that someone else was doing it, that there was a team. Because there isn't obviously a degree in DevOps as far as I know. It's computer science. So yeah, how would you suggest that like people find out about these things, or maybe develop skills and make them good candidates for these different roles?
So one of the ways that's really powerful for people that I feel is often overlooked is that pretty much in any domain that you're interested in, all the way from like art history to sports, there is some way that you can build either a computer application or a web application to improve or further your understanding of some field like that. Like I had a friend in college who built a baseball game simulator because it was something he was interested in, and he ended up showing that to a potential employer who gave him a job, basically because of the cool work that he'd done on that project. So personal projects play a huge role in furthering our understanding of what's involved in building a web application. So that's one thing I would highly recommend is try building a small application completely from scratch. That pick a language that you love, pick a topic that you're interested in, and don't feel like there's a pressure to produce anything. The goal is to explore. And if your exploration leads you to someplace interesting, great. If it leads you to someplace where you decide you don't want to do any more of it, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I think it's really just like being curious, and I think the other advice that I think I've gone myself along my career too is a lot of times if you want to learn something new or just explore, it's actually good to set yourself a goal. And so if your goal is I'm going to produce this app in this particular domain, I have to learn a bunch of things to get there, and a lot of things that I might not even know about. So I think that's really great. Okay, so maybe just like a few more questions there, then I think we'll sort of wrap it up. Moving just over to current events, what's sort of like happening in the world today. Like, what do you feel are just like more broadly, just on the business side, like some of the biggest sort of like threats to business in general at the moment? Do you have any high level thoughts on that? Yeah.
So high level thoughts on that. It's easy, especially for companies that have grown their cloud setups organically, to find that you have a whole bunch of resources that you don't think are open to the internet, but actually are for one reason or another. And it doesn't have to be a huge exercise to go and find these. There are great automated tools today that will either scan your existing cloud configuration. If you're working out of a configuration language like Terraform, you can scan the Terraform directly. That's one thing that is very top of mind for me is whenever we develop a new service application, making sure that it's behind either a tightly IP whitelisted firewall, or that we know it's going to be public and take appropriate precautions with a web application firewall or some other product that sits in front of it. As we saw with the Log4j disaster that happened last year, it's not always the big applications or details that make something a problem. It can be something as small as a logging library. So top of mind for me also is keeping dependencies up to date. There are great automated tools that can do this for you today as well. We use AWS Inspector for a lot of that, and Guard Duty, but there are products from Microsoft and Google that do the same thing. Also top of mind for me is the individual permissions inside your system. So again, and a lot of companies that have grown their AWS setup organically, there are some folks who've been with the company for a long time that probably have broader permissions than they need. And they're coming back to this automated tools thing that I keep harping on. There are great tools that exist that can tell you exactly which resources a user has recently accessed in like a 90-day period or something like that. And generally, you can scope the permissions pretty tightly to make sure they need no more than they actually need. So those are kind of the top of mind things for me.
Yeah, I don't know if you you followed. There's this webcomic XKCD. It's very popular. But there was a very topical Log4j issue, very topical post. I don't know. He did it a long time ago, but it's basically showing this sort of dependency tree of all these different open source libraries. There's one that like a few people maintain, way down at the bottom of the stack that actually becomes like the vulnerability. Yeah. So it's I think it is really like a fact of like modern sort of like software that there's a massive number of dependencies. And so I think a lot of the automation is definitely very important. We hear that quite a bit. Do where does like, I think one of the things that often comes up on this topic, and it's probably a good topic to wrap things up on, is whose responsibility is that? Like, I think a lot of times, there's sort of like diffuse responsibility around, who should really be in charge of like checking dependencies, managing security, things like that. And I think a lot of organizations would say that it's everybody's job, but then at the same time, sort of becomes no one's job. So I don't know what you've seen sort of work well or not work well around that. Yeah.
So one of the things that has worked really well for us, the Pill Club, is we actually set an OKR on the DevOps team around security risks like that. So we said, based on the severity of the issue, scored on the typical CVSS scale, if it is a critical issue, we need to have it 95% of the time we turn it around within 2 days or less. And we are working on getting there. It's a pretty big ask. But that helps give a sense of urgency to fixing these things when they are tracked in a company level objective. And what that has ended up looking like for us is that we partner very closely with backend engineers who need to make the updates and test the functionality to make sure it's still working. But we will typically set up the base change in a pull request. So it's basically like, hey, bump this library version to this level and see what breaks. And then it's your job to fix it, whoever has been assigned to this particular issue. And that's worked pretty well for us so far. We set intentionally, we set a 95% target on these things because we know there are going to be some issues that require very large changes that we may not be able to get to within that time frame. But it sets a pretty high bar. And we have seen engineers on the back end teams make time to fix these things because they also know how important it is. And they also know that I'll keep bugging them if they don't get it done.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, yeah, that's I think there's actually a lot of companies that learn around actually incorporating some of these objectives into OKRs. That sounds like a pretty fantastic process on your guys' side. So any closing thoughts? Like, we've covered a lot of different things here. We covered like some of the specifics of what you've done internally, some of the thoughts on Zero Trust, rolling things out internally, your background. Anything else you'd like to say to folks listening?
Gosh, that's a big responsibility, Alex. And so, if you are in this webinar, chances are that you have some interest in the technologies at play here. So first of all, I commend you for that. There are a lot of ways that you can improve and enhance the security posture of your organization. And whether you decide to adopt a zero trust technology or not, just the fact that you're here listening is really good. The things I would close out on would be to say, there are, one of the central challenges in software is how do I make use of the work of other people? Because you're always running out of time or have limited resources to accomplish a task. And most of the time, there is someone out there who has solved that problem already, more or less. There's a saying, there are no new problems in software engineering. And when I think about adopting any new technology, be it zero trust, be it Docker containers, be it changing IDEs, the number one thing I think about is, does this make use of a lot of work that someone else has already done? And that's one indicator of how much use it can be to you. So that might be my parting thought, actually.
I really like that. Well, great. Well, Cameron, it's been really enjoyable chatting with you. Thank you for presenting and sharing all your thoughts, and we really appreciate you guys as a customer as well. But thank you very much. I think we'll wrap things up here.